All right, so in this explainer, we're going to do something a little different. We're mixing history with geography to tell a story that isn't just written in books, you know? It's etched right into the landscape of India. We're talking about India's forests and how they were completely transformed by the needs of a massive global empire. So let me start by throwing a question at you. What in the world connects the British Royal Navy, the entire Indian railway system, and some of the planet's most famous environmental movements? I mean, they seem totally random, don't they? A navy, trains, and protests. But believe it or not, they are all tangled up in the same story, all connected by one single powerful thread. Yup, the answer is the forest. It's that simple and that complex. The forest was this silent, massive resource that literally fueled an empire. It's what made it possible to connect a whole subcontinent with steel tracks. And, as we'll see, it became a battleground, a real fight for survival and identity. So, where does this all start? Well, it begins with a really simple but absolutely insatiable demand. You see, the British Empire, when it was at its peak, it ran on wood, and it needed a lot of it. Okay, so what was all this wood for? Well, there were three huge reasons. First up, the Royal Navy. Their famous ships were built from oak, but England's own oak forests were basically vanishing, so they looked to India. Then you've got the railways. This was a game changer. They just devoured wood on an industrial scale, not just for fuel, but for all those little wooden planks, the sleepers, that hold the tracks together. And finally, money. Forests were just cleared away to make room for huge plantations of things like tea, coffee, and jute, all to feed the industries and tastes back in Europe. And if you're trying to wrap your head around the scale of this, just look at this number. 35,000 trees. That's not in total, that's every single year. And that's just in one part of India, the Madras Presidency, and only for railway sleepers. We're not talking about a few guys with axes here. This was the systematic industrial-scale dismantling of entire ecosystems. And this picture, this really brings it home, doesn't it? These are huge piles of teak logs. Now, this is actually from Java, where the Dutch were running a very similar playbook. But it shows you the sheer volume of wood being pulled out of these forests. It's so important to remember this wasn't just an Indian story. It was a pattern of colonial exploitation you could see all across the globe. Okay, so you have this massive demand for timber. But from the British perspective, the way trees were being cut down was just chaotic, inefficient. They looked at these vast, wild forests and saw, well, an unproductive mess. So they decided they needed a system. They were going to bring science and order to the wilderness to get the most out of it. And the man for the job? A German forest expert named Dietrich Brandis. In 1864, he was made the first Inspector General of Forests in India. His whole mission was to create a system, a machine really, to manage India's forests and guarantee a steady, reliable supply of timber for the empire. And the system he came up with was called scientific forestry. Now, that name sounds pretty good, right? But it's a little misleading. Scientific here didn't mean studying the complex life of the forest. Nope, it meant industrial efficiency. What they did was cut down the natural, diverse, messy forests and replace them with just one type of tree, whatever was commercially valuable, all planted in perfect straight rows. Super easy to manage and even easier to cut down. And to make all this official, they passed the Indian Forest Act of 1878. This law basically sliced up the forest into three neat categories. First, you had reserved forests. These were the best ones with the most valuable timber. Access for local villagers, absolutely forbidden. Zero. Then you had protected forests, where people could maybe take a little wood for their fire or to build a house, but not much else. And finally, village forests. This was basically what was left over, often the most degraded land. So, in one move, a resource that people had used for generations was just locked away. You see what's happening here? The very idea of what a forest is was being changed. It went from being this complex, living ecosystem, a home for countless people, to a factory floor. And the trees? They were just a crop waiting to be harvested. So, you can probably guess what's coming next. This complete overhaul of the landscape and the laws that governed it had an absolutely devastating impact on the people whose entire lives revolved around these forests. And this really shows you the before and after. Before the British laws, communities had rights. They could hunt, gather food, let their cattle graze. It was just life. But after the laws, all of those things, hunting, gathering, grazing, suddenly became illegal activities. Think about that. Your entire way of life just criminalized overnight. The forest was your home, but now you were a trespasser in it. Take shifting cultivation, for example. This was a traditional way of farming where you'd clear a small patch of forest, burn it to fertilize the soil, and grow crops. But the British banned it. Why? Well, from their point of view, it was a problem. It got in the way of growing those big, straight timber trees for the railways. Plus, they were terrified the fires would get out of control and burn down their valuable wood. But for the local communities, this wasn't just a farming technique. It was their food security. And it was gone. And this quote, it just says it all. People were forced to steal wood to survive. If caught, they were harassed by forest guards who demanded bribes. It puts you right in their shoes, doesn't it? You're denied legal access to the things you need to just live. So you're forced to become a criminal. And that just opens you up to a whole new level of exploitation from guards who know you're desperate. But people didn't just lie down and accept this. No way. These new laws lit a fire, sparking a century of resistance. And we're talking everything from armed revolts to some of the most famous, most iconic environmental movements the world has ever seen. One of the biggest early flashpoints was in a place called Bastar, back in 1910. When the government moved in and started reserving their forests, the local communities, like the Durwas, led by people like Gundadur, they fought back. They rose up and went after the symbols of colonial power. Police stations, government buildings, you name it. And here's a detail I find absolutely fascinating: how they organized it all. They passed secret messages between villages, but not written notes. They used symbols: a mango branch, a clump of dirt, some chilies, an arrow. To an outsider, it would look like nothing. But to them, it was a clear message, a call to arms that everyone understood. Now, the British did eventually crush the Bastar Revolt, but the spirit behind it, that didn't go anywhere. And you can draw a direct line from that early armed struggle right up to the famous nonviolent movements of the 20th century. You got the Chipko movement in the 70s, the women who literally hugged trees to stop the loggers, and then the Apiko movement in 83, which was inspired by Chipko. It's all part of the same long story of resistance. So why are we talking about all this history? I mean, this was 100 years ago, right? Well, because this conflict, the one that started under the British, it's not over. Not by a long shot. Its echo, its legacy is still shaping everything about the relationship between the government, the forests, and the people of India right now, today. And this is where that blend of history and geography becomes so clear. India is incredibly diverse. It has 10 major biogeographic zones, from the Himalayas all the way to the coasts. Each one is a totally unique ecosystem. And in pretty much every single one of them, you find the exact same debate still raging. How do you protect the environment while also protecting the rights of the people who actually live there? And this is the really crucial part. Even after India gained independence, a lot of the new conservation laws kind of just continued the old colonial mindset. The state knows best, the state is in control, and local communities are often excluded from the conversation. And that has led to decades of conflict, real struggles over who actually gets to control these vital resources. Which, of course, brings us right back to the central question. This whole struggle over India's forests, pitting the government against communities, economic needs against ecological survival, it all started with an empire's thirst for timber more than a century ago. And today, the debate is more urgent than ever. So I'll leave you with this. Who should get to decide? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a story of how a massive clash of ideas about what a forest even is, ended up completely remaking a nation's landscape. And you know what? That history is something you can still see today. All right, so let's jump right in with what sounds like a super simple question, but trust me, the two completely different answers to this one question, well, they basically set the stage for an entire century of conflict and massive, massive change. So, for the millions of people who actually lived in and around these forests, they weren't just, a bunch of trees. Not at all. A forest was home. It was the center of their entire world, the source of their food, their medicine, their fuel. It was woven right into the fabric of their culture and their communities. But then, for the colonial empire arriving in India, the forest meant something completely different. They looked at the same landscape and saw basically a giant untapped commodity. It was like a massive warehouse full of timber, just waiting to be harvested to build ships, lay down railway tracks, and, of course, make a whole lot of money for the empire. Okay, so how did they actually make this happen? How do you take this new commercial vision and force it onto a landscape? Well, they used a pretty powerful one-two punch, something they called science, and a whole bunch of really strict laws. Yeah, the government brought in this system with a super impressive sounding name, scientific forestry. But here's the thing, its main goal had almost nothing to do with ecological health. The whole point was to tear down these incredibly complex natural forests and replace them with these neat, orderly plantations. Think of it like a farm, but instead of growing corn, you're just growing one type of tree, like teak or sal, over and over again. And this really lays out the difference, doesn't it? It's night and day. On one side, you've got the natural forest. It's buzzing with all kinds of different species, it's balanced, and it's used by the local community. But on the other side, you get the scientific forest, just one type of tree, totally controlled by the state, and really its only purpose is to be part of a commercial supply chain. And the long-term cost of that shift, wow. You go from a strong, diverse system to a fragile one. It's a huge ecological gamble. So, to lock all this down, the British passed the Forest Acts. And this is where their strategy gets really clear. They literally carved up the land into different zones. You had reserved forests. These were the best ones, the prime real estate, and they were made totally off limits to locals. Then you had protected forests, where people could maybe get a few things, but only with super heavy restrictions. And even the village forests were, at the end of the day, still under the thumb of the state. Right. So what did all this mean for the actual people on the ground? The ones whose families had lived in these forests for generations. Well, to put it bluntly, it was an absolute catastrophe. Their entire world was turned upside down. Think about it. The simple, everyday things people did to survive. Gathering some fruit, letting their cattle graze, hunting for food, or farming the way their ancestors always had, suddenly all of it was illegal, just like that. People were basically turned into criminals in their own homes. Their only choices were to risk punishment for stealing what had always been theirs, or to work for the very same forest department that took their land, just for a chance to stay. And this wasn't just happening in India. It was part of a bigger colonial playbook. If you look over at Java, the Dutch were running a very similar game. They slapped on similar laws and they exploited these really skilled communities, the Kalang people, for their amazing knowledge of cutting and moving timber. And yeah, a lot of that was done through forced labor. But people didn't just sit back and take this. No way. They resisted. In Java, there was this incredible leader, Sorantiko Saman, who started a powerful movement. And his argument was just so simple but so profound. He basically said, the state did not create the wind, water, and earth, so it could not own them. I mean, that's not just a protest. It's a complete moral rejection of the entire colonial mindset. So this ideology of control, it wasn't just about managing the forests that were already there. Oh no. It went a step further. It actively fueled the massive clearing of forests to turn them into something the empire thought was way more valuable: farmland. So why? Why clear the forests? Well, from the colonial state's point of view, it made perfect sense. First, you could tax farmland, and that means direct money in the bank. Wilderness, on the other hand, couldn't be taxed. Second, you could use that land to grow cash crops. We're talking jute, sugar, cotton, all to feed the industries back in Europe. And third, there was this really powerful idea that forests were just unproductive wastelands that needed to be civilized through farming. And the scale of this, it was just immense. Get this number in your head: 2/3. That's how much of India's most common type of forest, the tropical deciduous forests, was targeted. Why them? Because that's where the good stuff was, the valuable timber like teak and sal. These forests basically became ground zero for the whole colonial project. They were prime real estate, either for state-run logging operations or just to be wiped clean for plantation. So this incredibly intense period of control and conversion, it didn't just, stop and fade away. Not at all. It left a permanent mark, like a signature, all over India's geography. It literally shaped the patterns of the plants and animals that we see today. And this table here is like a map of that legacy. It shows what's left today, and the crazy thing is, the very reason these different forests exist where they do is because of that history. Take the tropical evergreen forests. They were way harder to get to and chop down, so more of them survived. Or look at the mangrove forests, home of the incredible Royal Bengal tiger. They're still around, mostly because you can't really use that land for logging or farming. Every single one of these zones tells a story of what survived and why. So that brings us to the final question. When we look at a forest map today, are we just seeing nature, or are we actually seeing history? The big takeaway here is this. Those lines on a map that define a national park or a forest reserve, they aren't just lines on the ground. They're historical boundaries, sometimes even scars. The very landscape that we look at and think of as natural or wild is, in so many ways, the end result of this long, complex, and often brutal story. It's a story about two totally different ideas of what a forest is supposed to be. What we're seeing isn't just nature, it's a living, breathing artifact of history.